tardes a todos. El día de hoy tengo el placer, el honor de presentar en esta conferencia a John Marston. John Marston es profesor en el Centro de Estudios de Asia y África del Colegio de México. Su interés en Camboya surgió a partir de su trabajo en la década de los 80 en un campo de refugiados en la frontera entre Tailandia y Camboya y en el Centro de Procesamiento de Refugiados Filipinos. Completó su doctorado en antropología en la Universidad de Washington en 1997 y se basó en su investigación de campo en Camboya entre los años 92 a 94. Es coeditor del libro El Budismo en Camboya, Historia y Etnografía, publicado por el Colegio de México en 2006, y coordinador de las obras Antropología y Comunidad en Camboya y Tailandia, también publicado por el Colegio de México 2011, y la Antropología de las Fronteras de Tailandia como Espacios de Flujo, del 2016. Sus artículos han aparecido en distintas revistas científicas académicas, como por ejemplo Estudios de Asia y África, el Journal of Southeast Asian Studies, Contemporary Buddhism y en Southeast Asian Affairs, así como también en forma de capítulos en distintos volúmenes. Se especializa en Camboya y con regularidad lleva a cabo sus investigaciones en este país. Entonces le voy a dar la palabra a John. Lo comenté hace un rato en inglés, pero lo digo ahora para nuestros asistentes hispanohablantes. Pueden formular sus preguntas directamente en el chat, o también si quieren hacer su pregunta de forma directa, pueden pedir la voz en el chat para que al final de la presentación yo les active su micrófono. Entonces, bienvenidos a todas, bienvenidas. Welcome to everyone. Y le doy la palabra a John.
Well, thank you very much for your participation. I already see some names that I wouldn't have expected from attending from Sweden and Japan and India, and I'm really happy that you're participating. And these events are sort of still in the experimental stage. We're still trying to figure out how we do this kind of thing, and so I'm very excited to be here today. And today I'm going to talk about a Cambodian monk named Maha Ghosananda. I was approached by Satomi Miura of my center about giving a talk of this kind, and what seemed most logical would be to give a talk that I was scheduled to give as part of a panel at Association for Asian Studies in March, and then that event was canceled. And so what I'm going to do is give that talk, but of course, instead of a 20-minute talk, it becomes a longer talk, and hopefully goes into more detail in ways that are interesting to you. This relates to a larger research project on Cambodian monks who were in India before 1975. Most of them were students. In a way, it comes out of my interest in the figure I'm going to talk about today, Maha Ghosananda, because over the years I'd thought to myself how difficult it was to write about Maha Ghosananda. A few people have written about him, fairly brief things, and I've been told that it was difficult to write about him because he didn't write memoirs. He refused to give interviews about his life. There was fairly small amounts of documents. And but when I was in India, I met a couple of older men, former monks, and whose lives were fascinating. I began thinking about how one way to approach Maha Ghosananda would be to look at the cohorts of people, of Cambodian monks who were in India, and what happened to each of them in different ways. It turned out there were 31 of them by my count, and my idea was that by looking at all of them in their different ways, we could get some idea of the context sort of that informed the life of Maha Ghosananda, although several of them are quite interesting in and of themselves, quite apart from whether you're interested in Maha Ghosananda. So this talk was originally supposed to be given at Associated Vision Studies for an audience that of probably many of the people attending would have already known something about Maha Ghosananda. So what I want to emphasize to start out with is that what I'm going to talk about is not the most important, or not what we usually think about with Maha Ghosananda. Maha Ghosananda, maybe more than anything else, is known for a series of peace walks that he made in the 1990s at a time of political transition in Cambodia. But what I want to look at is his earlier life, what I've been able to learn about his earlier life. And so it helps to keep in mind that this isn't necessarily what most people would say is most important about Maha Ghosananda. But I hope that the things I'm going to talk about will also give some sort of insight into the social context of Maha Ghosananda, where he was coming from, what kind of influence shaped him in his early life and resulted in one way or another in him becoming an engaged Buddhist. I'm going to start the PowerPoint now. I hope I can do this without too much difficulty. Is that okay? I think that's...
Sí, lo vemos perfecto.
Yes, okay. Well, let's start with this picture. This picture is not something I found on the internet, and as far as I know, I've never seen it published in anywhere. But this is a picture of the from the walks that he's famous for. And actually, I found this picture it was in the scrapbook of a family in rural Cambodia that I found, and it shows to me that at the time he was giving his peace walks, pictures of like this were in circulation, and people kept them as sort of keepsakes. And so you get a sense of the scale. Maha Ghosananda with a group of monks who were involved in the peace walks. We don't get a sense that there were also many nuns and lay people involved in the walk, but this gives you maybe a sense of what he represented at the time he was involved in the activity he's most famous for. The panel I was originally supposed to give this paper at AS was a panel on engaged Buddhism. So I'm going to start out with talking a little bit about engaged Buddhism. I distinguish figures who self-identified with the term engaged Buddhism from historical figures to whom we may want to apply the concept in retrospect, based on our own conceptions of what engaged Buddhism is. Whatever the final impact of his life and work, Maha Ghosananda was in the former category as a founding member of the International Network of Engaged Buddhists. He was not a leader of a Buddhist liberation movement in the phrase that Queen and King used when they first began formulating the academic study of engaged Buddhism. Although many participants in his peace walks found them transformative, unlike B.R. Ambedkar, Buddhadasa Bhikkhu, or Thich Nhat Hanh, he was not a theoretician, the kind of thinker who worked out and put into practice a concept. His teachings, to the extent that they represent a body of work, came in the form of aphorism, conveying Buddhist teachings in essence, in ways that seemed to many to stem from a profound spiritual consciousness. Sometimes these were written down by followers, as in the book Step by Step. They were not written down by himself. They did not overtly give expression to political ideas, except to the degree that concepts like peace and metta have inherent political resonance. We identify him as an engaged Buddhist less from his teachings than from the projects he came to be involved with, and from the other Buddhists and non-Buddhists he associated with. At one point in Christopher S. Queen's introduction to the volume, Engaged Buddhism, Buddhist Liberation Movements in Asia, he considers some of the common characteristics of Anagarika Dharmapala, Henry Steele Olcott, and B.R. Ambedkar, which he felt apply to contemporary engaged Buddhism. One, the engaged Buddhists were high-profile personalities whose careers straddled and sometimes blended East and West. Two, the engaged Buddhists were dauntless activists for cultural renewal, social change, and an ecumenical world Buddhism. Three, the engaged Buddhists were honored by their followers as saints and bodhisattvas. Maha Ghosananda's profile was not as high as these three figures, and his activism was less clearly defined. But to varying degrees, he fit these characteristics. He straddled borders, moved increasingly in the spheres of world Buddhism, and has been called a saint. Key figures associated with engaged Buddhism are typically identified with one national Buddhist tradition or another, but they are often also figures who cross borders and whose political and philosophical stance may have broadened in the process of crossing borders. These were often borders of East and West, as Queen points out. But it may be relevant that several key figures associated with the idea of engaged Buddhism lived in India at one point or another in their lives. The directions they took may have been, to one degree or another, influenced by the ways that, in the context of post-colonial modernization, a combination of minority populations, immigrants, and academics shaped what came to be contemporary Indian Buddhism. The effect of transnational experience is part of what I'm interested in exploring here in the case of Maha Ghosananda. My sources for his early life before India are limited and already include elements of mythification. I draw on interviews with members of his extended family now resident in the US, as well as an interview with a key follower in Cambodia, the late Udom Van Sibon, who summarized the results of interviews she herself conducted in his home region. This is complemented by comments by a few other observers, some who at different times were also drawing on what they knew of Van Sibon's interviews. My sources have many inconsistencies on small details. Maha Ghosananda's date of birth, the year his father died, the year he became a temple boy, the year he ordained. Some patterns nevertheless emerge, and some of the more sensitive issues, such as his complex relationship with his mother, have credibility in the degree to which the interviews with family members and the results of Sibon's interviews coincide. And of course, here you have the picture on the left of Udom Van Sibon, and here is Chen Sunon, who is a niece of his, and her son Pokratna. Maha Ghosananda was born. His given name was Ba Yao. He was born around 1924 in rural Barai subdistrict, Dankeo district, Takeo province. His parents were first cousins, ethnic Teochew Chinese from Vietnam, who had first come to Kiribong district, which borders Vietnam. They spoke Vietnamese in the family, and his mother is said to have spoken Khmer with a noticeable accent. His father, Yang, died when Maha Ghosananda was very young. His mother, Siang, would later take a second husband, Tet, who drove a taxi between Takeo and Phnom Penh, but this resulted in divorce. By rural standards, she was prosperous. Chen Sinun, a second cousin, and her sons recall staying with her for 2 months when, because of the war, they fled from Kampot province in 1972. They remember a large wood house on stilts with ceramic roof tiles. There were servants. Siang's principal occupation was a store selling groceries and sundries, but she also had rice land which other people worked. There were oxen and buffaloes which could be rented out to farmers. On her property was a pond with a small island accessible by a bridge with handrails she had built. On the island, family members said a bo tree had begun to grow spontaneously. Maha Ghosananda's mother had once raised fish and silkworms, both activities which entailed the taking of animal life. But following a spiritual crisis, gave this up. She was no longer doing so in 1972 when Chen Sinun and her son stayed with her. Stories in circulation point to Maha Ghosananda having a strong spiritual vocation even in childhood. And his inclination toward practices that would be prominent later in his life, like a concern with physical cleanliness and a predilection for walking. One story is that when left in charge of his mother's sundry store, Maha Ghosananda Visantra-like, and gave things away instead of taking money. Another story is that accompanying his mother when she went to catch fish, he would release the fish his mother gave him back into the water, so that she had no choice but to kill the fish right after catching them. By all accounts, Maha Ghosananda went to live in the Buddhist temple as a temple boy at an early age, perhaps as early as 7, although he did not ordain as a novice until his late teens. Given his mother's relative wealth, living in the temple would not have been an economic necessity, as it was with many boys. Chen Sinun even suggested that he went to live in the temple because of his unhappiness about his mother raising animals. Sivon likewise suggested that his mother was motivated to have him live in the temple because of tension surrounding the episodes mentioned above. He doubtless also associated the temple with education. He likely attended primary school there. According to Linda Chott, he later attended a government-sponsored all-boys boarding school in the nearby provincial capital. And I quote, he was described by those who attended school with him as having been a very shy adolescent who was kind and loved by his peers. His one quality that was most obvious to his schoolmates was said to be his beauty, his fair skin, and above all else, his self-consciousness toward cleanliness. Unquote. He ordained at Wat Panya in the provincial town. If his one biography distributed by his short biography distributed by his organization stated he was born in 1924 and ordained in 1943, he was 19 at the time. He must have gone to Wat Unalam soon afterwards. Wat Unalam was the administrative center for the Mahanikar order, and he would have been directly under the supervision of Samdat Junat, the Mahanikai patriarch, and his circle, advocates of a reformed Buddhism which placed great emphasis on modern education and the study of Pali texts. If he arrived in Phnom Penh in 1943 or 1944, it was during World War II, when French colonial administration was in an uneasy stance of cooperation with Japanese troops stationed in the country. He would have arrived following the 1942 Umbrella War, a key moment in the Cambodian nationalist movement when the defrocking of a senior monk led to protests with a large monastic contingent and the arrest of several key monks. The Mahanikai order would, until independence, tend to identify politically with the exiled nationalist leader Son Nyuk Tan, who worked in the Buddhist Institute before fleeing the country in the aftermath of the umbrella demonstrations. We don't know to what extent this may have shaped Maha Ghosananda's political consciousness. Most likely, Maha Ghosananda was already at Wat Unalam on February 7th, 1945, when U.S. bombs, perhaps targeting nearby river port installations, hit the temple. Maha Ghosananda fled by foot to his home province, Takeo, over 70 kilometers away, and returned 4 or 5 days later. Without a doubt, an emotional landmark for a monk who would be closely associated with peace movements. The Mahanikai patriarch Samdat Junat is often said to be his preceptor when he took the higher ordination as a bhikkhu, probably in 1950. Maha Ghosananda already had a reputation as a scholar of great spirituality before going to India to study, and the fact that he was chosen to go is an indication of his growing status. Even then, according to Zibon, he was writing poems and proverbs. He's said to have visited the Bo tree on his mother's land before making the decision to go to India. Later, he would bring a Buddhist image from India to place in front of it, a bronze, black-colored, sitting Buddha about 1/2 meter high. He was approximately 30 years old when he went to India. He would come back from India to visit every 2 or 3 years. Chen Sinun recalls that when she was 9 years old in 1954 and 1955, Maha Ghosananda went to see King Sihanouk perhaps immediately before going to India or on a first visit back to Cambodia. And the head of state offered to make him a royal clerk, a position of great prestige. She remembers being thrilled at the idea, that someone from extended family might become a royal clerk. Both the stories told by family members and the stories told to Sibon recall tensions between Maha Ghosananda and his mother over his religious vocation. Tensions which eventually were resolved with her becoming more deeply Buddhist. While these accounts may be tinged by how more broadly a narrative of the religious path is conceived, they no doubt have elements of truth. The storied image of the mother is of a petty, selfish woman who comes to change her ways. At one point, Maha Ghosananda was visiting from India. Samdachu Nath called her to Phnom Penh to receive a gift. She had visions of receiving money. But when she opened the wrapped package, it was to her disappointment a book and a set of clothes. His mother was said to have taken a strong stance in opposition to him staying in the monkhood, calling on him to disrobe in order that her line be continued and there would be an heir to her property. She wanted him to marry a relative from her side of the family. Maha Ghosananda is said to have responded by asking her to give him his share of the inheritance right away so that he could give it away in religious donation. According to Chen Sinun, things reached a point on one occasion that she threatened him, raising up a big machete of the kind used to slice banana trees for pig food. I quote, he shut his eyes and said, "Mother, you can do what you want." After that, she never brought it up again. In Chen Sinuan's version of the story, she became so hysterical that she lost consciousness. The most dramatic story is also the one which raises the most questions about how myth enters into the historical account. And I'm going to have to keep this brief. This story told in greater and lesser detail by all three of Chen Sinuan's sons. And there's some inconsistency in the stories. It's also found in Pope Ratana's published memoirs. That is, the Pope Ratana is one of Chen Sinuan's sons. In it, Maha Ghosananda's mother goes into a trance-like near-death state, which is called plit in Khmer, in which she descends to Buddhist hell, where a satanic keeper of the gate asks her what merit she made in her life. She answers honestly that she had never given charity to the poor, had given orders to kill animals, and had never given money or food to monks. And in the quotation on the screen, you see, after she heard that question, she was unable to answer because she was in a state of confusion. She was left to be tortured while her arms, torso, and legs were tied with ropes to the post. Then her son, Yao, that is to say, Maha Ghosananda, who was in a bright saffron robe, flew in front of her, but said nothing to her. She immediately called for Satan to come over and began telling him, "Sir, I used to offer food and cash to my son, who has been ordained as a Buddhist monk. Why didn't you tell me when I asked you that question earlier?" Satan questioned. "I was in a state of shock and I didn't remember," she responded. "Okay, at least you have done some good deeds with a Buddhist monk. Thus I will release you from hell." Maha Ghosananda was one of three Cambodian monks who went to study in the newly created Nalanda Pali Institute. Later, Nava Nalanda Mahavihara, envisioned as recreating the ancient Nalanda University. He went in late 1953 or 54. At the time, the King Sihanouk was in the process of negotiating Cambodia's independence from France. Maha Ghosananda and the other two monks, Amsuad and Mirchan, went with the sponsorship of an association, the Pali Association, later called Mit Bhutika Vidyalaya, Friends of the Buddhist Lycée. Beginning in late 1955, the association in turn drew on scholarship funding from the American Institute, the Asia Foundation. Considering how long Maha Ghosananda was in India, he was there close to 15 years. We really know only very little about his experience there, and what we know is very fragmented. But enough details emerge that we begin to get a picture. Navanalanda Mahavihara had only been recently created, and And it would not be until 1956 that its main building would be inaugurated. This was a heady time when scholars and students, many of them Buddhist monks, were arriving from many different countries. Donations were being made to the library, and buildings were being constructed. It was a different kind of education than he would have received at University of Delhi, University of Calcutta, or Banaras Hindu University. But it was an education deeply oriented toward Buddhist studies, heavily focused on languages, and took place in a setting rare in India, where to be a Buddhist monk was considered natural, despite India's symbolic importance for Buddhists as its original home. Only a small fraction of the Indian population has been Buddhist in modern times. The founder of Navanalanda Mahavihara, Jagdish Kashyapa, was one of the most important Indian Buddhist scholars of the time. Like two other Buddhist intellectuals he's closely associated with, Rahul Sankrityanan and Anand Kalyanan, he came out of a Hindu reformist movement, Arya Samaj, which emphasized the scriptural authority of the Vedas, was drawn to what he perceived as the egalitarianism of Buddhism, and ordained as a Buddhist monk after going to Sri Lanka to study in the 1930s. A picture of the three monks in the 1956 issue of Bhuttika Vidyalaya, accompanying an article by Suan, one of the other three monks, shows them at the Buddha Jayanti celebrations at Bodh Gaya with crowds of monks behind them, together reciting into a microphone, a religious chant to be broadcast onto Indian radio. Some indication of the importance of the Buddha Jayanti celebration for him and their sponsors in Cambodia, and how they represented international Buddhism in India. Suan's article states that some 20,000 persons were present. Bodh Gaya is in the same province as Nalanda, and they probably attended in the company of Jagdish Kashyapa, one of the speakers. All this was shaped and colored by the Cold War dynamic of the times. The Asia Foundation was staunchly anti-communist, and a recent scholarship has shown that its support of Buddhism was part of a CIA-funded program to build up Buddhism as a defense against communism. By 1957, it had begun questioning its willingness to support students attending Navanalanda Mahavihara. Memos argued that the academic quality of the institution was low. However, it was clear that the primary issue was its fear of links to the left and to communism. The earliest memos are more careful in their wording, but later memos make reference to communist infiltration. A 1958 memo, which you see on the screen, wrote that Southeast Asian Buddhist bhikkhus among others at Nalanda, are encouraged to do postgraduate work at Peking because of, one, Peking offered travel grants, scholarships, special invitations, etc., and two, the director and probably some other members of Nalanda University as well have been to Peking and are sympathetic to its Buddhist propaganda appeals. Thus, Nalanda University becomes a staging point for Southeast Asia bhikkhus eventually en route to Peking for indoctrination. A result of the cultural relations program exchange between Peking and New Delhi. There's already in November 1958 a reference in a Asia Foundation memo to the decision not to give further scholarship aid to Maha Ghosananda. New information about the course of studies at the school, as contained, for example, in Richard Gard's letter of 20 September 1958 to Harry Pearson, suggested this is not an appropriate place for Cambodian monks to be aided. For this reason, we have rejected an application from the Bhuttika Vidyalaya to assist Bhikkhu Vayao, whom we've aided in the past, to continue for his PhD at Nalanda. The fact that the issue is still being discussed in March suggests internal debate. The March memo goes into this in more detail than other sources. It is not hostile to Maha Ghosananda himself. It shows that there had been friendly communication with him, and that the possibility had been discussed of his studying elsewhere, including Japan or at Yale. It even goes so far as to suggest that, quote, we were talking in terms of having Narada, another famous monk at Vajrayam Temple, Colombo, and Vayao, test out Dr. Pelser's plan for establishing a Buddhist center at Yale, unquote. The memo refers to the fact that Maha Ghosananda's doctoral thesis had to do with a comparison between Buddhism and communism. The document did not in any way suggest that Maha Ghosananda had communist leanings himself, although it was concerned with the possibility that supporting a student working on this topic could have negative repercussions for the Asia Foundation. Three arguments are made. First, that I quote, if the thesis were to be published and distributed in Cambodia and contained the reference to the onrush of communism, it is conceivable that the Asia Foundation might be criticized for supporting a monk who was concerning himself with political ideas of the relationship of Buddhism and communism, unquote. Secondly, there was fear that the government of India might question the appropriateness of the topic. And finally, there's again reference to Gard's critique of Nalanda, and the last analysis, the key issue. I quote, in view of Dr. Gard's strong reservations against Nalanda, we do not believe that we could suddenly reverse our stand on this institution just to accommodate Ba Yao, unquote. In the end, Maha Ghosananda was supported by a government of India scholarship for the remainder of his time at Nalanda. These Asia Foundation memos are among the few contemporary documents we have of Maha Ghosananda in the period when he was studying in India. That's the question of the degree to which Nava Nalanda Mahavihar was in fact a hotbed of the left is not easy to answer. It is clear that many of the students who studied there give no indication of any political orientation. However, leftist progressive elements were definitely present in Indian Buddhism at this time, and students so inclined could doubtless have found support there. We recall that Jagdish Kashyapa was closely connected with two other Buddhist intellectuals, Rahul Sankrityayan and Anand Kausalyanan, both well known for their interest in the connection between Buddhism and Marxism. Older staff at Nava Nalanda Mahavihara confirmed that Kashyapa was Maha Ghosananda's doctoral advisor. Kashyapa would sometime later in 1968, near the date when Maha Ghosananda finished his doctorate, publish an article in the Mahabodhi Journal in which he discusses the relationship between Buddhism and Marxism. In this article, he explores parallels between Buddhism and dialectical materialism, a theme we know that his close associate Anand Kausalyanan often addressed in public talks. He suggested there are important parallels between Marxism and Buddhism and the degree to which they see the world as one of movement and change, of, quote, matter as motion, and I quote, the fundamental laws of the dialectical materialism of the transition from quantitative change to qualitative change, of the unity and struggle of opposites and of the negation are exactly the same in the Buddhist outlook. This requires further analysis. In the end, he differentiates the Buddhist outlook from that of Marxism by what he states is Buddhism's broader conception of mind, and by the way that Buddhism provides a method for individual transformation. Would Maha Ghosananda's planned thesis have taken the same approach that we find in Kashyapa's 1968 article? We don't know. For some reason, no copy of his thesis survives. The other major event in the history of Indian Buddhism, which took place while Maha Ghosananda was in the country, was the public conversion to Buddhism by B.R. Ambedkar, one of the most important Indian intellectuals and political figures of the independence period, who was of Dalit, that's to say untouchable background. And I don't have time to go into this very much. We don't really have, it isn't evident that Maha Ghosananda incorporated ideas from Ambedkar's book, The Buddha and His Dharma, into his thinking, but he would have been affected by the general tendencies Ambedkar's Buddhism represented to equate Buddhism with egalitarianism and social progress, and to see Buddhism as a path a liberation for those at the bottom of society. Major influence on Maha Ghosananda was, by most accounts, the Nippon-san Myohoji movement of Nichidatsu Fuji, an important figure in the literature of engaged Buddhism. Again, my comments are going to have to be brief here. Elaine Kensett, who worked closely with Maha Ghosananda in New England beginning the 1980s, recalls bringing him to the construction site of the New England Peace Pagoda in Leverett, Massachusetts, a Nippon-san Myohoji project, and him talking with the Japanese monks about Nichidatsu Fuji, whom he said he had known. On another occasion, she accompanied him to the inauguration of the pagoda, and he was overjoyed to meet a Japanese monk, possibly Yagi Shonin, with whom he said he had studied in India. Nichidatsu Fuji, a Japanese Buddhist monk in the Nichiren tradition, had traveled extensively to promote Buddhism in India in the 1930s and was resident for a period at Gandhi's ashram in Modera. He was a strong advocate of nonviolence. The movement he built up in the post-World War II period, identified with its peace walks and with the construction of peace pagodas, had a conspicuous presence in India. One of the earliest and most important peace pagodas was a stupa built during the time Maha Ghosananda was in India at the site of some of the Buddha's most important discourses, Vulture's Peak in Rajagir, only a few kilometers from Nalanda. We can readily conclude that Maha Ghosananda had contact with this movement. It's harder to evaluate how deep the connection was or in what precise form it took. I'm indebted to Savannah Lot, a student at Navanalanda Mahavihara, who after my visit there talked to older staff and wrote down their stories about Maha Ghosananda. The stories he records point in a number of different directions. First, they emphasize the breadth of Maha Ghosananda's international connections. He was already a notable polyglot. He probably came to Nalanda already knowing Khmer, Vietnamese, Thai, and French. Besides English, which would have been used in study, and Sanskrit and Pali, he acquired skills in Sinhala, Hindi, and Bengali. Locha's informants do not mention Maha Ghosananda going to Japan, although that's possible. But they recalled him traveling to Sri Lanka and Burma during the period he was in India. Another theme that emerges from Locha's interviews is the importance for him of Vipassana meditation, something perhaps we have not sufficiently mentioned so far. I quote, he constructed a small hut made of made of bamboo and thatch for solitary living and practicing meditation, unquote. Perhaps most intriguingly, with reference to Maha Ghosananda's career of engaged Buddhism, is that he actively taught Dhamma to the peasant community surrounding Navanalanda Mahavihara, very much in the spirit of the Neo-Buddhism associated with Ambedkar. And you see the quote on the screen. He could speak in Hindi fluently, and his main intention was to bring Buddhism to the masses. He was close to common people, the farmer, the laborers, and workers in Nalanda, and they also heartily loved and believed him. In the decade of 1960 and 70, he was indeed a famous monk, not only among the academic community of Nalanda, but amongst the poorest of the poor people in this locality. So this takes us to his time in Thailand. When he was at a forest monastery in southern Thailand. Much of what we know about Maha Ghosananda's time in Thailand is based on the writings of Christopher Titmuss, a well-known British meditation teacher who was together with Maha Ghosananda at Wat Chai Na in southern Thailand, where they studied under Ajahn Dhammadharo, another important teacher of Vipassana meditation. The American under Ajahn Dhammadhara, another important teacher of Vipassana meditation. The American Jack Kornfield was there for some of the same time, and we can supplement what Titmus has written with Kornfield's observation and interview with what Kornfield has written about Ajahn Dhammadhara. And I note also that you see on the right is Titmus referred me to another monk who was there at that time, is also a Thai monk, well-known meditation teacher named Maha Ghosananda. The picture we see here, which I found on a website about Jack Kornfield, shows Ajahn Dhammadhara and 6 other non-Thai monks, 4 of them Western, standing in a row, single shoulders exposed in the Mahayana style, barefooted. Flanked by 2 Western laymen, they stand in front of a Thai language sign identifying the retreat center of Ajahn Dhammadhara. In the 1970s, one of the laymen holds an open book. The monks and the other man stand arms resting in front of them, each with a hand on the wrist of the other arm. Titmus states that Titmus stands, this is Titmus here. He is between Ajahn Dhammadhara and an Indian monk, Nagasena, who was also a translator. This is Maha Ghosananda, of course, and he's standing next to Jack Kornfield, looking less directly in the camera than the others. Titmus states that Maha Ghosananda arrived at Wat China in 1972. Kornfield, I guess this is supported by various sources that state that Maha Ghosananda spent time with another Thai monk who was quite famous, important, Buddhadasa Bhikkhu, before arriving at Wat China. According to Titmus, Maha Ghosananda visited Buddhadasa Bhikkhu perhaps for about a month, but quote, was not under Ajahn Buddhadasa's guidance. In the longer version of this paper, I talk more about Buddhadasa Bhikkhu because he's, and here I don't have time to do that, but what we need to know is that Buddhadasa Bhikkhu's life and thought and his connection to engage Buddhism and these have been written about extensively, and so his connection is also intriguing. But we know very little about it. Buddhadasa Bhikkhu is described as the most important Thai Buddhist thinker of the 20th century, and he's been written about extensively in English. But I think I'll let it go at that. It's reasonable to assume, as Kornfield suggests, that Maha Ghosananda went from Suan Muk, the temple of Buddhadasa Bhikkhu, to Wat China in search of a deeper, more directed meditation experience. Ajahn Dhammadhara was more associated with meditation. I quote Kornfield as saying, it may have seemed to him after a time of scholarship that he didn't want to be in an urban monastery. It is possible that Maha Ghosananda already had some contact with Ajahn Dhammadhara, or even had met him at Sarnath, as one informant told Napakadol Kitisini. Although Wat China is in the 4th tradition, and one encounters entering the 6-acre Wat, the organization of forest monastery, was, unlike Suan Muk, on the outskirts of the town of Nakhon Si Thammarat. Napadakol Kitasini says that the Wat is now totally surrounded by the urban sprawl of Nakhon Si Thammarat, although the area around it may have been more rural in the 1970s. At the time Titmus was there, the Wat had some 70 to 100 monks and a more or less equal number of nuns. More than 12 Western monks had studied there by this time. Ajahn Dhammadharo is said to have come to his spiritual practice late in life after 2 marriages, after his own extended period of intensive meditation in a single room of a Buddhist temple. He traveled in the south of Thailand. Buddhadasa Bhikkhu played a role in helping him turn Wat Chai Na into a meditation center. Perhaps, as one native of the area suggests, turning over to Ajahn Dhammadharo, a site which Buddhadasa Bhikkhu had once considered developing himself. Hornfield, describing Wat Chai Na more or less at the same time that Maha Ghosananda was there, writes, more than half the temple is given to the 2 large compounds for male and female meditators. The monks section has more than 50 tiny cottages surrounding a large open square where several hours of walking and standing meditation are done on en masse daily. In addition, the compound contains one of the town's burning grounds where meditators can periodically observe cremations, undertaking the cemetery meditations to add perspective to their practice. Meals are taken together early and late morning in the large hall. Titmus, writing of his personal experience at the Wat, emphasized the overwhelming emphasis on meditative practice, which was considered much more important than other elements of the monastic life, such as Vinaya and mastery of chanting, which have greater importance in the majority of Thai Buddhist temples. Titmus writes of Maha Ghosananda, the arrival at Wat Chai Na, that, quote, he wore the yellow robes of the city Buddhist monk rather than the brown robes of the forest monk. He carried 2 small bags, one hanging from each shoulder. He walked gracefully, slowly, and with remarkable serenity, unquote. Ajahn Dhammadharo clearly took Maha Ghosananda seriously from the beginning and gave him the best koti, the best residential hut, a newly built brick structure which raised eyebrows. And here's the quotation you see on the screen. I remember wondering to myself whether the new arrival, clearly a man of Buddhist scholarship and great humor, would last in the austere climate of this Vipassana monastery. Ajahn Dhammadharo forbade the reading of books. He quoted the Buddha, who said that monks who study but don't practice cannot be said to be followers of the Dharma. The Ajahn had no interest in Abhidhamma, learning Pali or chanting. Our Cambodian monk would not only witness the austerity of the monastery, but would have to listen to the evening Dharma talks from the Ajahn that showed little regard for Buddhist scholarship and monks with titles such as Maha that are conferred on those who qualify in Pali studies. I had seen some city monks and scholar monks come and go. Maha Ghosananda isolated himself, sticking to his hut, only ate 1 meal, and did not always attend the evening Dhamma sessions, things that would normally not be allowed, but Ajahn Dhammadharo somehow allowed him to be an exception. Titmus was at Wat Chai Na with Maha Ghosananda for less than 2 years, although by default we take his description as representing the entire 7 years when Maha Ghosananda was there. We have to assume that this period represented change, if only in the deepening of his meditative practice. Political change was taking place in Cambodia, and Maha Ghosananda was aware of this. The narrative surrounding Maha Ghosananda is linked in our minds with that of the Pol Pot period, the period of recovery following it. Titmus writes in this vein as well, telling how, in response to 1973 bombings, Maha Ghosananda told him, quote, the rivers of Cambodia are full of blood. We know that Maha Ghosananda returned to Cambodia at least once during the period when he was in the forest monastery. His uncle, interviewed by Suvon, told her that he returned once more in 1975 before the country fell to Pol Pot. I quote, at that time he rode alone in a white car to Wat Barai. All the villagers came and stood to welcome him happily and respectfully. The last point I would like to make makes reference to an article written by Josephine Stanton, the wife of the former U.S. ambassador to Thailand, who tells of Maha Ghosananda coming to a Dharma study group she participated in at Wat Pavonavet in Bangkok, and how this meeting led to Maha Ghosananda going to camps for Cambodian refugees on the Thai-Cambodian border. This story properly belongs to a later chapter about Maha Ghosananda's time working in the refugee camps, but I would like to focus on the detail that Stanton met Maha Ghosananda when he came to talk to members of a Dharma class at Wat Pavonavet, a major Thamayut Nikaya temple in Bangkok. Stanton refers to Maha Ghosananda coming to the class as, quote, an unexpected visitor and teacher. Her story contradicts Titmus's version of the events, where Maha Ghosananda hears on a radio broadcast of the flood of Cambodian refugees and makes the decision to go to the border. But it's not hard to reconcile the essence of the two versions. Despite Stanton's wording, Maha Ghosananda surely already knew about the refugee crisis. And he may have come to Bangkok looking for a way of going to the camps. The monks at Wat Pavonavet may have known that Stanton would be able to help him. What interests me is Maha Ghosananda's presence at Wat Pavonavet and the implication perhaps that he was already known there. Vijnan tells us that Maha Ghosananda went to Bangkok many times during this period. Keeping in mind that Maha Ghosananda continued to go to Bangkok and was known to monks who would, for example, invite him to participate in a Dharma class with foreign participants, perhaps gives us a more nuanced view of Maha Ghosananda's relation to the Thai Sangha, the Thai monkhood in this period. I raise this not in any way to downplay our sense of the intensity of Maha Ghosananda's period of meditation in the forest tradition or its importance to the roles he would assume for the rest of his life. It is useful to keep in mind that this forest monk was also already one who could be at ease among the elites of the Thai monkhood. So to conclude, all this, I believe, sheds light on the public person that Maha Ghosananda would become in the years to come. His work in refugee camps, his activism for peace settlement in Cambodia, the peace walks he led in the 1990s, his leadership of newly created Cambodian temples in the US, and his involvement in interfaith organizations promoting peace are all rooted to one degree or another in the directions he took in this early period of his life. At the same time, I would like to emphasize the complexity of this background, starting with the complexity of his family life, reformist and nationalist movements in the Cambodian monkhood, Indian Marxist Buddhist thinking, the Buddhist movement associated with Ambedkar, the Nipponzan Myohoji movement, and the thinking of Buddhadasa Bhikkhu. They can all be characterized in broad terms as progressive, but they represent very different directions. And to the degree that Maha Ghosananda synthesized them, it was a complex balance. And all this combined in perhaps surprising ways with his deep ongoing dedication to Vipassana meditation. One should note at the same time that Maha Ghosananda's complex relation to Buddhist traditions of at least 3 countries, Cambodia, India, and Thailand, and probably Japan, Sri Lanka, and Burma as well. And the synthesis of these traditions perhaps created possibilities that would not have been found within a single tradition. Returning to Queen's 3 characteristics of engaged Buddhists referred to in the introduction, we see Maha Ghosananda straddling and sometimes blending various cultural traditions. We see at least the beginnings of his interest in cultural renewal, social change, and ecumenical world Buddhism. And we see a persona emerging that some at least would characterize as that of a saint. Okay, well, I guess I did that. It's exactly 7 o'clock. Let me get out of this mode and
Thank you, Jan.
So do I need to turn over the do I need to turn something over to you, Roberto?
It's fine. I can manage.
Okay, great.
Thank you, John, for this really interesting presentation on Maha Ghosananda, a figure which, as you have shown, was very important in Transnational Buddhism during several decades of the last century. Gracias, John. We are going to begin a round of questions and answers. If someone wants to ask a question, you can either write it directly in the chat, but you can also engage John directly. For it, you can please ask for it in the chat, and I will activate your microphone. So I will say it in Spanish. Muchas gracias, John, por esta presentación. Quienes deseen, bueno, vamos a abrir una sesión de preguntas y respuestas. Entonces, quienes deseen pueden escribir su comentario, su pregunta en el chat, pero también pueden hacerla directamente a John. Entonces, por favor, pídanlo en el chat y yo puedo activar su micrófono para que hablen ustedes directamente, ¿no? Entonces, if anyone wants to make a question, please let us know in the chat. Okay, then Napakadol wants to make a question. Just a second, please.
Hi.
Yes, I have unmuted you, so you can talk directly to John now, Napakadol.
Hi, can you hear me?
Hi,
Yes.
Ig. I'm really glad you could
I'm glad to see your presentation, and thank you so much for this wonderful presentation and also the photos. Yeah, that's fascinating. What I'm always wondering about is, and I would like to ask you, after you review all of his like patches of stories about him, what do you think about Maha Ghosananda seeing himself as an engaged Buddhist? I mean, you know, like, to me, only Thich Nhat Hanh who coined the term engaged Buddhism, right?
Right.
Yeah, would how to say, affiliate to this term, but what I feel mostly for other monks or other thinkers who have been called as engaged Buddhists would rarely openly affiliate themselves with this term. So in Maha Ghosananda's case, what do you feel about this term when he's seeing himself?
I you know, of course, he didn't write. He didn't. I don't know if there's any case of an interview which he used the term, but the important thing in this case is that, as you know, in addition to Thich Nhat Hanh, there was Sulak Sivaraksa, who was who considered himself in the tradition of Buddhadasa Bhikkhu, although Buddhadasa Bhikkhu, as you pointed out, did not actually use the term engaged Buddhist. But Sulak Sivaraksa, this Thai public intellectual, he created the International Network of Engaged Buddhists, and Maha Ghosananda was a founding member of that. And so to that extent, I think we can say he publicly identified himself with that term in a way that he was early on in the literature of engaged Buddhism. you know, even before the peace walks, there's a book of collections of writings by engaged Buddhisms, and he's in that book. I think it's a prayer or something like that. But he was not an intellectual. He didn't talk in intellectual terms, but he identified himself to that degree with this organization early in the 80s. And what that means, I'd like to know more. But he did very much identified with this organization, and to that extent, I think we can legitimately say that he claimed, or that his actions identified themselves with engaged Buddhism.
Yes, and also I have been wondering about this term in Cambodia because part of my past work is also dealing with that kind of field, right?
Right, yeah.
I never heard of anyone, I mean, in the field of Buddhism and education, or the Buddhism and social work in Cambodia, translated this term into Khmer. I mean, the term engaged Buddhist. Maybe
Right.
maybe it's I overlooked, or I took it for granted. But to my perception, I never seen anyone translate this term. I mean, and yeah.
You may be right. I can't think of any examples either, but I will say that in the Cambodian community in the United States, there, and this is in English, I don't remember it being used in Khmer, although there must have been a term in Khmer. They used that. Several temples and monks associated with those temples identified themselves with the term engaged Buddhism in the United States, among the Cambodian temples of the United States. And there was, like, when there were disputes between two groups, they would say this group was more oriented toward engaged Buddhism than that group. And so I think it was a concept, at least among the Cambodian American Buddhists, and some of these who were calling themselves engaged Buddhism saw themselves in the tradition of Maha Ghosananda. So although they were, in some ways, the term was used in very different ways, I think, than the ways that Maha Ghosananda or Sulaksivaraksa were using it originally. They used it for, temples that were engaged in social projects. So, like the temple in Long Beach being engaged with youth who were members of gangs. They taught that, but engaged Buddhism. And the question is that really the same way it was being used, say, by Sulaksivaraksa, but you find, I have seen this discourse at least among Cambodian Buddhists in the United States.
I see. That's interesting. Thank you.
John, I have a question.
Yes.
Also, you mentioned at the very beginning that according to this definition of queens of what is a figure which can be called an engaged Buddhist, you mentioned that besides his or her political activities, they were seen by their followers or by some people as saints or holy figures. In the case of Maha Ghosananda, and of course specifically in the case of Cambodian Buddhism, what does it mean to in this specific case? I mean, is it that Maha Ghosananda is perhaps seen by some people as an arhat, or as a monk that which has that has some special powers. I would like you to maybe if you have something about.
Yeah, well, this is something I thought about saying in this talk today, that there's an American Buddhist monk, and I think his Buddhist name is Santidhamma. His American name was Tom Flint. And he wrote a small book about Maha Ghosananda called Buddha of the Battlefield, and he very much said this is a hagiography, and that he's writing it because he believed that Maha Ghosananda was an arahant, and other people have said that too, possibly more Westerners than Cambodians. I prefer not to use that kind of terminology myself. But I think he did have and when I think I saw him once from a distance. I never actually talked to him, and at that time I wasn't so interested in him. I became interested in him later, although I was in Cambodia at the time of his peace walks, and they were all very moving to us. They really captured. I don't know whether they accomplished much in social terms, but they seemed to symbolize something important. And but many people, and this includes at least some Cambodians as well as some Westerners, felt like they were in the presence of someone of great spirituality. And there is, when I first began watching him on video and things, I did not find that so much, but I began to feel that, although my purpose is not to present him as an arahant, to say that he somehow had a capacity to evoke a strong spiritual presence for many people. I don't know if that is evidence of arahantship, but the term arahant has used. I think Christopher Titmuss as well, in my communication with him by email, I think he also used the term arahant. So.
Yeah, it's interesting in order to see how Maha Ghosananda is seen in its own context of Cambodian Buddhism. But as you said, many of the people that characterize him as arahant are not Cambodians but Westerners. So
right, yeah, that's interesting. And I don't think there are that many Cambodians in the audience, but might be one or two. And I'd be interested in their comments on that. And I should say that when I've been working on this longer than I like to think. And when I first started working on this, I felt that interest in Maha Ghosananda was decreasing and in Cambodia, but now there seems to be a renewed interest in him, and different people use him in different ways, for political agendas or whatever. I'm not sure that all the interest in Maha Ghosananda is positive, but whereas when I first began working on this, my impression was that people were not really talking about him that much anymore. And then I think he is beginning to have more and more symbolic importance for Cambodians, at least in the sense that Cambodia wants to have its list of great monks, and there's a need for someone who can symbolize this for Cambodian Buddhism. And I'd be interested in the comments of anyone else in the audience who might have thoughts about that.
Okay, you have a question by Tanya Karina. She's asking how was the level of acceptance of Buddhism at the end of the Khmer Rouge?
Well, that's really very relevant to this whole issue, and it's a complicated thing. But there was after the Khmer Rouge period, there was a great interest in rebuilding Cambodian Buddhism, and for political reasons that, well, after the Pol Pot period, Cambodia was liberated by a socialist government backed by Vietnam, and with a strong Vietnamese presence, which has been criticized. And there were still, throughout the 80s, there was still a great deal of restriction on the practice of Buddhism, partly for fear that that if young men became monks, they would not enter military service. And so, but nevertheless, temples were rebuilt. People were very grateful to have Buddhism once again. And then, but it wasn't until the end of the 80s that there began to be, after there was a political changes that allowed there to be a more free practice of Buddhism. And then there was a lot of energy was put into temple building, and a lot of activities involving Buddhism. This included wealth coming in from the diaspora community. A lot of wealth was put into Buddhist temple building, and I see this as a time when Buddhism began to flourish again, although other people continue to say that Buddhism is in decline and that young people are not as moral as they used to be. It's the same story that right after, when young men could become monks again, many young, like in 1989, and even, well, there's a period of time when young men were not allowed to become monks, and then in 1989, a lot of young men entered the monkhood, and but since then there's been decline of the young men who want to become monks, and so and people will blame this on the Pol Pot period, blame it on, say that, you know, this because of this destruction of Buddhism, that it's never recovered. But definitely Cambodian Buddhism is undergoing a process of change, and it's not the same as it was. And for older Cambodians, this represents decline. But there are other aspects of Buddhism are building up again. The Buddhist university system, Cambodian monks going to India or Sri Lanka to study. You're beginning to have highly educated monks again. So there's some positive things as well.
We have time if for more questions or commentaries if someone wants to engage directly, John. You have a question by Robin Bidulp.
Okay.
Yeah, there is time. You are seeing it, John?
What?
Okay. He's asking, he a PhD in India, but that he was not an intellectual and did not speak like one. Do you think that was a deliberate choice or just the way he gravitated?
I think it was a deliberate choice. I think I think in his youth he was an intellectual, and he, in the course of his studies, I think there probably were times when he was quite intellectual, but then he rejected it. He chose to go to a forest monastery where he well, in the Titmus book says the Titmus thing that I quoted said that Ajahn Dhammadharo prohibited the use of books, but someone else I interviewed said that he actually did have lots of books in his hut. But he, in some ways, he would put down intellectualism. He had a joke that PhD stands for person has dukkha. Dukkha means suffering. So he was given another story. Someone I interviewed. This is a much later part. When it was like he was given an honorary degree, and then he just sort of threw it away. And he gave it to one of the older women in the temple. Said, "Here, take it. I don't need it." And so, in a way, he was more of a well, his thinking was aphoristic instead of logical. I'm interested in a book by Ghananath Obiasekari about the Enlightenment experience, and Ghananath distinguishes between two kinds of thinking: the sort of the logical thinking, and another kind of thinking which he calls it thinking. I think that is more aphoristic and more intuitive, and so what we see in Maha Ghosananda, at least in the later point of his life, when people actually are writing about it in a way that we can evaluate it, is sort of this rejection of intellectual type thinking, logical thinking, and more of a sort of he had this capacity for aphorisms. I mean, if you look at that book step by step, when I first read it, I just thought it was all platitudes. But then the more I get into it, there are little gems of aphorism there. And he had this capacity to somehow capture the essence of things in a few words. And but he was not, he was more of a poet than an intellectual. Or if that, I mean, to call him a poet, of course, that seems to undermine his spirituality as well. But he was, he had an intuitive spirituality, I guess. I mean, that again, that's not an adequate description of it. So.
Okay. Thank you, John. I think we do not have.
Okay. Yes. Well, thank you very, very much, all of you who attended, and I appreciate you coming. And for all of us, I think this is a bit of an experiment, and I hope it went fairly well. So thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone. Muchas gracias a todos. Vamos a concluir entonces. Les agradecemos le agradecemos mucho a John por haber dado esta presentación y a todos ustedes por haber estado presente con nosotros.